Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope you're doing well. So, I was thinking about how the topic of slavery gets brought up a lot against Muslims, and if you're anyone who's studied world history, you'll recognize the fact that slavery was a part of war and conquest. And when you look at a deeper level, we kind of have to look at how slavery really made some of the strongest people out there in endurance and suffering. Whether it was Aztecs taking slaves, different tribal peoples, the Mongols, you name it, people had slaves. And one must consider, why would such a job field where you don't have the same liberty be allowed? In the end, it makes you wonder how maybe it was a way of teaching people a lesson of gratitude and also providing opportunities to do good to liberate people from their predicament. And also one can just think about hierarchy in general, pecking order, case systems. There's so many different ways you can analyze the topic of slavery. And so when I look at the past, when people talk about Islam having slaves, doing the slave trade, it was so distant in the past that it doesn't really affect me. But what I do find interesting is if you're honest with yourself, if you really don't like a group of people and you go to war, enslaving them can kind of feel good. What do I mean by that? Well, how do we enslave countries today is a different method of slavery. It's debt slavery. Burying nations in debt and sophistication methods that usually don't seem as ugly, but they are pretty ugly. The way colonization of the mind happens today, the enslavement of the mind, all that, well, it's done in a different way. And ideas now can keep people in lockstep. And social media and the internet can keep people perpetually in a state of mind where they are slaves to their own lusts and where they're encouraged to take out debt, to buy cars they really shouldn't have, houses that maybe they could find at a better price somewhere else, and an education that can be found for half the price at a different institution. So today, getting you in debt and making you subservient to Wells Fargo and stressing you constantly over finance is a way to control your mind. They don't necessarily need any type of literal chains or punishment of escaping a plantation or a work field or something like that. So the way we conquer enemies today has evolved. The way you conquer them is by having your minions go in and you buy up their land, you buy up their businesses, you regulate them to death, you put sanctions on them, you do stuff like that. So conquest has changed. But conquest in the past had severe consequences. If you knew your family was going to be slaves, your men better fight. You better keep your men strong. And you better care about what kind of leader you have, because if you lose, slavery is your abode. So having that as a risk factor, because very few people wanted to be slaves, I think that it helped people be more moral. That it helped people see the consequences of electing a corrupt dinosaur leader who only cares about money, themselves, and narcissism, and where power and dominance was valued. Today you have the victimhood culture, and if you examine it and see what kind of mental illnesses are coming from victimhood culture, and then contrast that to the past where kings would execute kings, where soldiers were beheaded, where people were drawn and quartered, where life was more a quick end. Dungeons were used. Inquisitions occurred. It was a very different world of might and power. It really just kind of goes to show how soft our kind of world is today, What we risk is a different kind of risk. And what they risked back then was different. Just look at Ukraine and how they have a leader who is a comedian who wore high heels and did a gay music video. He's going up against the bear, the Russian bear, and is losing. And it kind of just goes to show you, when you elect a feminine male who cosplays as a soldier, who is uber corrupt and wants to line his pockets of cash instead of doing what's right for his people, and making better decisions and not lining up with NATO and not trusting America, for one, well, maybe his people wouldn't be suffering as much. There's so many really interesting ways that I think that people who rant about slavery don't look at. If you look at the Mamluks, the Muslim Mamluks, a lot of them were slaves and they created a huge empire and they founded their new Cairo. And the Mamluks fought the Mongols. And so it was quite fascinating to just study how those slaves rose through the rank. They were military slaves and were powerful. I really like hearing the stories about people who were sold into slavery and they overcame. Those people are actually role models, and you shouldn't pity them. You should pity people who live a soft, cushiony existence, who swallow pills, eat poorly, are addicted to porn, video games, and have mental illness. Those are the ones you should pity. But the strong men and women who endured slavery, and some had a softer life, a slave in a palace, different kinds of conditions of slavery, they all had something that they could learn and pass down in terms of wisdom. They were more than just slaves. And people who pretend to be affected by slavery today, I'd argue, are just transferring that ancestral victimhood consciousness to themselves so they can feel special. And so that they can feel like they're somebody unique, instead of just being who they are and letting the past rest in the past. So for me, it doesn't bother me that slavery existed in the past in Islam. Would I want to be a slave? No. But when you look at the gladiators who were slaves in Rome, they had to fight to the death to the crowd watching them. They had to fight lions and tigers while people watched and cheered and ate bread. That's a pretty brutal end for the slaves, but the gladiators, they were slaves, and really rich Roman women would pay to get pregnant by them. They were sold into brothels sometimes, and some of them worked in brothels after they bought their freedom, and they got countless women pregnant and spread their genes. And the wealthy Roman women, they actually liked those masculine men instead of their posh, softer partners who worked in government, and those slaves' genes spread. So it's just a fascinating way of looking at it, and slavery throughout so many of the pagan eras was also common. Whoever lost brutally. So for me, that is how I look at it. And if somebody is using a modern lens on, ancient warfare and ancient type of rules, I feel like, have you looked at what we do today with carpet bombing? How Biden has sanctions on Afghanistan that are starving people? There's so many behind the scenes, cold, calculating legislation that affects generation upon generation, and that doesn't really get looked at. But slavery is looked upon because it was more physical and apparent rather than hidden. And so I just find it quite interesting to look at, and I'm not offended. Someone's like, Islam allows slavery. Yeah, and what do the secular liberal atheists in America allow? Much worse. And I know some might say that's whataboutism, but it is true. There's lots of modern problems that are worse than slavery. And if you actually had time to reflect and care to reflect, I feel like you would begin to see that point. So, if someone asks me about slavery in Islam, I'm just going to reply with those points. To pretend like you're outraged about an ancient thing that hasn't existed for a long time, I find it very odd. The people were more than slaves, and a lot of those slaves were more moral than the free people of today. And those certain slave masters, some of them, were required to maintain their slaves so they could work. I don't think all of them had it bad, and Prophet Yusuf, may Allah be pleased with him, was sold into slavery and still achieved greatness. I don't think slavery is an inhibitor to greatness. Rather, I think it is a test and trial. And if you have to be a slave to earn paradise, when you can earn hell and be a free man, compare that and examine it. There's a lot of nuanced ways you can look at that serious topic outside of a liberal lens and more on a raw, spiritual, analytical lens. And I think that's more rewarding than letting people victimize you and put you into a sort of weird consciousness that is always looking to be the special one in the oppression Olympics. But again, there are people who are free today who are getting lithium for electric cars, who are looking for diamonds for the elite. They are free, but they work for $1 a day, and their existence is pretty rough. If I was a slave to somebody who was wealthy, or on a rural farm, didn't really get beaten or just beaten when I didn't work, would that be better than working a 9-to-5 minimum wage, welfare in the projects where gangbangers rule and shoot and kill people all the time? You see what I'm saying? Would you rather be a slave in a beautiful area than to be a free man in an area where there's violence and defunded police and brothels and drag queens in your school? Think about it. The context of being both free and enslaved are very, very serious issues with much nuance. And again, we're all the slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just makes you think. So I don't really feel like the slavery point against Islam is a gotcha. Especially when you study the empires of the past and see what they did, and then you see what we do today. That's hidden by a lot of liberal journalists. They don't really cover what their side does or what both sides do. They're too busy covering nonsense topics or pretending inflation is good and other really weird topics. And I believe that is by design. So, as you explore history, you'll see that life on Earth has been pretty brutal. And to pretend like new ways won't be invented is just disingenuous. There are worse fates than slavery. Being free to drink yourself to death. Liberals who want to legalize tax and regulate all drugs so that you can put yourself in a drug coma, have your teeth rot out, slowly poison yourself. A slave is required to be sober to work, whereas a free man has the luxury of loitering in front of a gas station and shooting up heroin until he perishes on the street like a dog. So there's a lot to examine. A lot to examine, that's for sure.